Well, it appears there are major plans for the United States to expand its military presence toward the southern hemisphere. This includes an expanded presence in Australia and, in the long run, a new airbase on the Cocos and Keeling Islands, a territory of Australia. It's located in the Indian Ocean, sort of halfway between Australia and Sri Lanka. There's talk the islands would replace the U.S.'s current Indian Ocean base on Diego Garcia, which is leased to the U.S. by Britain. That lease runs out in 4 years. And while the specifics of the new base remain under wraps, an in-depth report by the Washington Post found the location to be, quote, ideal for manned surveillance aircraft as well as unmanned drones. Also, an official review conducted inside Australia found there's been a big push to expand the naval base in Perth. Now, these are just a few of the details of an agreement announced back in November by President Obama and the Australian Prime Minister. Here's President Obama speaking during that visit.
There are no better friends than the United States and Australia. In some of our darkest moments, when our countries have been threatened, when we needed a friend to count on, we've always been there for each other.
Well, I want to talk a lot more about this with Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. Island, those are islands. Ivan, let's kind of cut straight to the chase here. This is about China, right?
Right. It's one more step in containing China. That's definitely why all these alliances are being expanded, more bases, more training, et cetera, in that area.
There's been a lot of criticism from both sides, and people in Australia not happy about this, and people in the U.S. As well. And I want to put up on screen, I know recently the former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski did an interview with Slate, and I want to put up what he said. First, he said a little bit sarcastically, he said, "I was not aware that Australia was about to be invaded by Papua New Guinea or by Indonesia." Then he went on to talk about China, saying, "To define our engagements in the East in terms of China is a mistake. We have to focus on Asia, but not in a manner that plays on everyone's anxieties. It becomes very easy to demonize China, and they will then demonize us in return." Is that what they want? Ivan, do you agree that this is something that perhaps should have been considered a little more?
Yes, and Brzezinski was always a Cold War during the Soviet period. And so I think he's not a friend of any sort of communist system. So this is very smart advice. I think he has realized that the Cold War is now over and that we need to engage China. And what's really interesting about U.S. policy in the Far East is China is loaning us money so that we can help our allies there, who are all rich countries, defend themselves against who? China.
Interesting. Yeah, it is kind of a strange system how those dots are connected. You were talking about, the Cold War era. Certainly some of the major bases that were crucial back then, military bases, a large military presence in Japan, in South Korea. There's talk that that's going to sort of be shuffled around, that a lot of the people, the resources that were at those bases will be shuffled into Australia. What do you think the impact of that would be?
Well, I think it's, it's clearly aimed at China and the South China Sea, which is a major shipping lane, and also China's been acting more assertive in that area. So I think you're still going to have a policy of containment. It's just kind of shifting the balls in the air a little bit, but you're still juggling the containment policy. And we still have those alliances with Japan, South Korea. There's also previously been some shuffling around in South Korea, but it really doesn't amount to a change in the policy. If anything, it's beefing up the presence there, as President Obama has said that he's going to do in relation to China. But the United States just can't afford this anymore, and we can't afford a base in the Coco Islands. And we have $15 trillion national debt, and some of these overseas bases should be contracting instead of expanding.
Absolutely, and that meeting with President Obama and Prime Minister Julia Gillard back in November, some people were somewhat surprised by these announcements, this announcement of a bigger military partnership. There was also an interesting reaction by China. They basically said that this is a bad decision on the part of the U.S. and that Australia could actually be caught in the crossfire. Talk to me about what Australia has to gain from sort of playing host to the U.S.
Well, I think Australia is a thinly populated country, and it's very wealthy by world standards, but it's, it's dwarfed by China's potential power because China has a lot of people, their economy is growing rapidly, and that sort of thing. And so I think Australia, as like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand, even communist Vietnam, they're all trying to get it sheltered under the U.S. wing because they fear a rising China, when actually I think the United States should be only the balancer of last resort and let these countries do more. But of course, they're not going to do more for their own defense if the United States keeps doing it for them. So, you don't pay your rent if somebody's paying it for you. And that's what it amounts to.
That's absolutely true. Now, according to the Washington Post report, some of the things that would potentially be built, and the U.S. government is trying to make it very clear that this is not something that's going to happen in the next few years, even the next few decades. We don't know if that's true, but what they're saying is that it's an ideal location for both manned surveillance planes and unmanned drones. What do you foresee that this will look like if this is indeed the next sort of future Diego Garcia?
Well, I think it could be done in stages. You don't need as long runways for drones and that sort of thing as you do for if you were to put like B-52 heavy bombers like they have in Diego Garcia or other bombers that we have there. And so I think, this could be ramped up over time. The Australians seem to think this hasn't been thoroughly discussed. They were kind of caught unawares by this, but certainly at the lower levels this is being discussed, and it could be a plan for the future.
Is any part of this simply the U.S. government and the Pentagon trying to send a message, or is this actually just the next strategy in terms of military defense? Well,
I think they're trying to send a message to China, and they may have been trying to send a message to the Australians that we're ready to do this, and we want to talk about it now.
All right, it should be interesting to keep our eyes on that. A very interesting report. I think caught a lot of people by surprise, all those details. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute.